So, about a month ago now, we did a video covering the last battle analysis poll winner being Hitsugaya and Matsumoto versus Basby and Kangdu, in the first real fight of the second Quincy invasion. However, there was considerable vocal support for seeing the poll's runner-up be covered too, and I always try my best to accommodate that where I can. So this time the fight we're looking at is none other than Sajin Komamura versus Bambietta Basterbine, a truly explosive battle with an incredible twist that sees everything put on the line. Now, as I'm sure some of you probably already know, Komamura has always been a character I'm personally quite fond of. A real unsung hero of the Gotei 13's lineup, who I've always believed Kubo quite liked, but often found himself at odds with Komamura's relatively lacking popularity whenever he tried to give him cool moments and chances to shine. As such, Komamura has a pretty bad reputation among the rest of the captains for being essentially cannon fodder, but I think it's mostly undeserved, and this particular battle gives him some really unexpected and welcome development. I've said it before that of the 4 captains who lost their Bankai during the first Quincy invasion, Komamura's story is by far and away the most interesting and the most well developed, and that really comes to a head here in a dramatic fashion. Now, is this fight perfect? Absolutely not. There are things I'd have changed, particularly where the ending is concerned, but on the whole, it's a great showing for an underappreciated character. So, without further ado, let's take a look at Komamura versus Bambietta, the last stand of the captain of the 7th Division. Before we get started on the video, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach content like this every single week. And if you enjoyed the video, when you're done with it, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well to help support me and the channel. And if you want to take that support from me another step further, I do also have a Patreon as well, where you can go and support me if you enjoy what I do here on the channel. And as always, a massive shout out and a huge thank you goes out to every single one of you supporting me over there on Patreon. I really do appreciate each and every one of you. And of course, if you hadn't guessed by now, there will be spoilers for the 1000-year Blood War arc of Bleach in the video to come. Much like the last fight we looked at on the channel, this is another of the earliest battles of the second Quincy invasion, and another one that deals with the stolen Bankai subplot. Except this one doesn't really, as Bambietta loses Kokujo Tengen Myo before Komamura even returns to the Seirete. I always thought that was a little bit weird, and it's another reason why I've always felt this subplot is dealt with far too quickly in general. It would have been cool to at least get to see Bambietta tearing up the place using Komamura's Bankai first, but like BG9, she never actually uses the Bankai she stole, which feels like a missed opportunity to me. I appreciate that Bambietta's shrift can cause more than enough damage already, but the giant looming shape of Komamura's Bankai provoking despair and devastation among the Shinigami rather than being an image of salvation feels like exactly the sort of spiteful physical and psychological warfare the Quincy's would have liked to wage. Now, pitting Komamura against Bambietta has always felt like a really unique matchup to me. I'm not entirely sure what Kubo was going for. There's generally a theme in his fights between the two combatants, but I'm not sure what he was going for, if anything, at all by pairing these two together. Is it supposed to be a sort of Beauty and the Beast theming, almost like a fable theming, Little Red Riding Hood and the Wolf, something like that? Or maybe it doesn't mean anything at all. That being said, I do think they work well together, and again, I wish Kubo had done a little more with it. Komamura's staunchly serious and noble attitude versus Bambietta's playful, almost childish whimsy tinged with that hint of murderous darkness is a cool dichotomy, but one that isn't explored all that much. In fact, speaking of the two combatants, this is quite a strange fight in that it ends by completely demolishing both of them, reducing them both to states almost unrecognisable. It's quite strange in that way, especially where Bambietta is concerned. You see, Bambietta was definitely an up-and-coming fan favourite and one of the principal members of the Sternritter. Along with characters like Asnot, Bambietta made a huge splash during the first invasion, and I think people rightly expected her to be a fairly big deal among the enemy army. But after this battle, which again, I'll remind you, is chronologically only about the third fight to take place during the second invasion, and still during the first day, before night has even really begun to descend, Bambietta is a changed character for the worse, with Kubo effectively sacrificing her at the altar of a different member of the Bambis, Giselle, who perhaps Kubo decided he preferred. Personally, I would agree with him if that was the case. I think Giselle is a much more interesting villain, but you can't help but feel bad for both Bambietta and the early fans she accumulated. And then there's Komamura, who, while I do enjoy his subplot, pays far too high a price for not nearly a definitive enough victory. As we progress through this battle analysis, I want to explore a potentially different route Kubo could have gone with the character, one that still ends in a way that punishes the captain for his personal transgressions, but gives him more to do on the grand stage of the war itself. Anyway, this is a decently long fight lasting from chapter 554 to 558, and while it's not technically broken up, which is a good thing, it also kind of is. In fact, the first half of this fight is weirdly structured in general, to say the least. 554 is broken up with a mixture of scenes setting up the oncoming fight, and supposedly other fights as well, and scenes with Yhwach and Uryu, while 555 is a seemingly totally random chapter featuring Ichigo in the royal palace just slapped in the middle of this fight due to the awkward cliffhanger set up at the end of 554. I maintain in general that 554 is a weird chapter in that it seems like it is setting up multiple fights to come, what with the shot of all the holy forms activating, BG9 and Kangdu resurrecting, but then it only in reality actually sets up one, the fight we're already about to see. But who's actually involved in this fight? Well, of course, there's the main combatants, Komamura and Bambietta, but it does go a little beyond that. The 5th Division, who basically get given nothing to do throughout the war, actually show up here for a moment. Both Shinji and Momo arrive to assist Komamura for some reason, in what I can only presume is meant to be a quick callback to Komamura deciding to stand with the Vizard in Fate Karakura Town. Of course, Iba is nowhere to be seen, which I would say is weird, but when it comes to this character, it's not really. The last time we saw him prior to the invasion, he was training outside Komamura's grandfather's cave, so presumably Komamura had to have walked past him when he left the cave. Did he seriously just leave Iba behind? We do glimpse Iba briefly when the Vandenreich take over the city, but as we saw with Kyone and Sentaro, Iba could just as easily be looking at this transformation from the outside of the Shakon Maku. No, instead he turns up later when the fighting is over to assist his captain, which of course we'll get to, but again it just seems weird that Kubo decided to dedicate time to Shinji and Momo randomly, when he could have easily spotlighted a very underutilized character at the start of the battle who would have actually made sense to have been there. Now don't get me wrong, I actually really like the notion of characters moving around the battlefield organically, meeting up with other allies and forming unlikely teams like pieces on a board, but I just think in this particular instance Iba really needed some love, and this was a chance for him to get it. But anyway, with all that out of the way, let's take a look at the fight itself. As we reach chapter 554, 2 previous fights are wrapping up. Kubo gives us this very nice chapter cover page showing us the current whereabouts of the 4 sternritter who stole Bankai in the previous invasion. Both Kangdu and BG9 have been defeated for now, with Kangdu frozen in place and BG9 suffering a pretty serious head wound. Meanwhile, Asnot and Bambietta are reacting to the disappearance of the Bankai they stole. Like I said earlier, it's weird that 2 of these sternritter never get to use them. Imagine if we only saw Kangdu and BG9 defeated, then the scene changed and we see Kokujo Tengen Myo, maybe looking slightly different due to being under Bambietta's control, completely destroying a battalion of Shinigami officers as Bambietta gleefully moves this huge suit of armour. Maybe in a display of her personality, a nice little character moment, she makes the armor do something stupid, like strike a pose, before it suddenly vanishes behind her altogether. That being said, I do like how Kubo portrays Bambietta when we see her next. She's cool, calm, and collected despite losing the Bankai. She callously detonates a part of a tower that some Shinigami are standing on before ranting to the other Bambis about their situation. Interestingly, she comments that the others are getting getting too worked up over losing a power that was never theirs to begin with. How does she know that? How does she know that Kang and BG9 are getting worked up? Are the Sternritter able to communicate with each other somehow across the battlefield? It's true that of the four of them, Kang and BG9 do come across as the least experienced, I would say, or at the very least, definitely the most afraid of losing Bankai. But then I'd argue there were other mitigating circumstances at play too in their defeats. BG9's body literally shuts down, for example, which is a little hard to deal with. Regardless, Bambietta realises that Komamura isn't in the Seireitei at all, since his Bankai flew away when it returned to him from afar. Presumably, she's been looking for him up until now, but as she turns around for some validation, or at least some kind of reply, she realises that she's been abandoned by the rest of the Bambis. I want to do a video on the Bambis in general, but their dynamic regarding Bambietta is really weird, I think. Bambietta is their self-proclaimed leader, and they're even named after her, but you assume again that that's a name she probably came up with, but she's rarely seen interacting with them at all. You get the sense that they're all supposed to be friends, or at least as friendly as the Sternritter can be, but they seem to not really like Bambietta all that much, or they have a pretty low opinion of her and don't really want to be around her. Little Toto certainly seems to consider herself too smart to hang around with Bambietta, but then I'm kind of surprised she's great friends with someone like Candice instead. But anyway, Bambietta becomes enraged by the fact they abandoned her, and she unleashes a colossal explosion that swallows up the surrounding area. This reminds me a little of how Bazby can seemingly just control fire outside of actually using his named abilities. Bambietta can generate explosions despite the fact that's not really how her The Explode actually works at all, and strangely she never really uses this again. As Bambietta proceeds to raze the entire area to the ground in an effort to get the rest of the Bambis to show themselves, Komamura arrives, quite literally out of nowhere, crashing onto the battlefield in front of her. There's a really cool shot of him towering over her, dressed in an entirely new look. Although Bambietta only comments on his new helmet, Komamura's entire design has been revamped from his post-time skip look, now harkening back to the heavier, bulkier armour he wore during the Soul Society and Arankar arcs. Honestly, he looks really cool here, his enormous shoulder pauldrons and massive breastplate giving him the appearance of a knight in shining armour arriving just in time to save the day. When I first read this chapter all those years ago, I didn't think twice about the fact Komamura was once again wearing a helmet. I didn't think Kubo was hiding anything, I just thought he included it as a neat little throwback. How wrong I was. Now, another point, where did Komamura get this armour? Presumably from his grandfather, since he says it was a gift, but why does his grandfather have it in the first place? I'd love some more information on it. Did the armour belong to Komamura's grandfather back when he had human form, however many years ago that was? What's weird about this, though, is that the elder of the Beast Clan berates Komamura for hiding his Wolfman form for all those years, meaning he looks down on Komamura for wearing his helmet in the first place. So why would he have one, and why would he give him one now? Komamura says it's a gift, but if anything it feels like one last insult from the Elder, who we'll talk about a little bit later. I think he's a dubious character at best. But it's almost like he's saying you wanted to attain your true human self, go ahead, but wear this helmet so no one can see you for what you really are. Unless that's precisely why he gave it to him, so no one would be prompted to ask Komamura any questions about his clan's identity and truths. Anyway, Bambietta wonders why Komamura is wearing a bucket before saying he should have arrived a little later, as the hero isn't supposed to appear until the last moment. At this point, Shinji appears again out of nowhere, perched on the remains of a wall. Swinging Sakanade on his finger already released, he says they're not fit to be heroes, as they're not willing to wait for the Seireitei to be destroyed before making their grand entrance. This is where things start to derail a bit and get a little weird. Komamura arrives for his big fight against Bambietta, but Shinji then just completely takes over. Did they coordinate this at all beforehand? And I seriously doubt it, because Komamura wasn't even in the Seireitei until just now. As Bambietta asks Shinji who he is, she suddenly smells the scent of Sakanade's mist and is caught in its spell. We get one of the best panels of Shinji, probably in the entire series, as he twists and spins around, flipping upside down in a great representation of what the world must look like to someone as Sakanade takes hold. Shinji then, rather than attacking the very confused Bambietta, who gets these small spirals in her eyes, which is a nice new detail attributed to his Zanpakuto, tells her all about how his Zanpakuto actually works in the exact same manner he did to Aizen before. As Bambietta kind of moves towards him, Shinji reveals he's actually behind her, and he tells her that he doesn't like cutting down girls before apologising to her. However, before he can do anything at all in true Shinji fashion, a light breaks out of Bambietta's chest, and her Vollständig activates in a torrent of crystalline blue light. Much like Kyuuge before her, Bambietta is treated to a full-page transformation ritual, which is nice to see, and I'm pretty sure this is the last time we would ever see one of these full-page Vollständig columns of light, which is a little bit of a shame. But this whole sequence is just so weird to me. From the way the activation of Bambietta's holy form is framed, it looks like she isn't in control of releasing it herself. It almost seems to me like Yhwach is meant to be triggering it from afar. This is when the holy form in general begins to lose focus, I think, with some activating randomly in alignment with Bambietta's across the battlefield, and just overall, they're not being given much prominence to any of them at all. As Bambietta transforms, Komamura, remember that he's here too, and Shinji look on shocked. Bambietta reveals she couldn't use Vollständig while she had Komamura's Bankai, as Bankai was apparently in the way, and that the Shinigami taking their Bankai back has apparently uncorked the holy form essentially, and allowed it to flourish. Again, this doesn't make a lot of sense to me. How did Bankai get in the way exactly? The sternritter steal Bankai via an external method that has nothing to do with them or their own bodies or powers. They use a medallion which houses an aspect of Yhwach's own Sanct Altar power, meaning the Bankai is kept and stored somewhere completely separate to themselves via a power that's completely separate from theirs. So I don't really see why a Quincy wouldn't be able to use both at the same time. Kyuuge was actively trying to steal Ichigo's Bankai while he was using his holy form, so would he have just not been able to use Tensa Zangetsu until he disengaged his Vollständig? As much as I do like the Quincy holy form, it's without a doubt the least well thought out and well rounded of the race transformations in Bleach, as well as the least consistent overall. But Bambietta thanks the Shinigami for allowing her to use this power as multiple holy forms activate across the battlefield. Now I'd argue this is where the fight really gets started for real, even though the next chapter focuses almost entirely on Ichigo. But when we do return to the Soul Society, Bambietta's new form is revealed, the Pillar of Light shattering like glass around her. Shinji doesn't even have time to react as he's blasted by the Sternritter. Meanwhile, we see the other Bambis are indeed watching the fight from a nearby rooftop. Candice comments that her Vollständig resonated with the others and her wings popped out, prompting Giselle to note that Candice can now use it. That's an interesting little line, and it actually lines up with the speculation that Candice is the weakest Bambi of the bunch, if she was the last of them to learn how to use the holy form. Meninus then notes that Bambietta has used hers, and Lil Toto says that she used it because she was angry with them, which to me goes against my theory that Yhwach activated it for her. But then if Bambietta did activate it herself, it's a shame we didn't see her use her Quincy Cross, or a Laden Hand Glove, or anything like that. But we do get a cool shot of Bambietta against a backdrop of an intense inferno, as Giselle ominously says that the battle might end quickly since Bambietta is essentially crazy. Bambietta's Vollständig is fine. I don't think it's as interesting as Kyuuge's, and it unfortunately starts the trend of holy forms not being named. As the next chapter begins, Shinji sails through the air, multiple bombs surrounding him. When you think about it, about how the explode actually works, it seems unlikely to me that Shinji would really survive this strike, because presumably the moment Bambietta activated her new form, she launched a Reishi Ball at the captain, it embedded itself in his chest, and in a split second it turned his chest into a bomb. So she basically just blew open his entire torso. Bambietta reveals that she's now free of Sakanade's influence thanks to her shrift, the Explode. If her sense of direction is all messed up, then she'll just simply destroy everything around her. She does have an ability that's almost a perfect counter to Shinji's, and as a result, he's sitting this one out. Bambietta then proceeds to rain bombs down onto the ground from up high, and we're treated again to a very nice aerial shot. There's some really great artwork in this fight throughout. However, Komamura has somehow defended against all of them, this time without so much as a scratch, protecting the wounded Shinji. Meanwhile, Hinamori leaps into the sky, jumping into battle against Bambietta. This is a small moment, but I actually quite like it. It's cool seeing Hinamori mostly keeping her cool, despite the fact she's trying to avenge her fallen captain. As she moves to attack the sternritter with Tobiyume, Bambietta's face contorts with a twisted mad glee, but Komamura steps in and rescues Hinamori, shielding her from another onslaught of bombs. One quick comment about Hinamori. Does she activate her Shikai without calling its name here? When she leapt high above Bambietta, it looked to me like she had her hand on her sealed Zanpakuto, still by her waist as though she's preparing to actually draw it. Then she swings it at Bambietta, and the next time we see her, her Shikai is active. Could Hinamori have learned Bankai at some point? It's possible, I suppose, though I think it's probably unlikely, and it's more likely to simply be an oversight on Kubo's part. But there's no reason why Hinamori can't have learned Bankai outside of the fact that she spends an awful lot of time in the emergency room. As Komamura manages to save Hinamori, pinning her to the ground and allowing the bombs to sail overhead, they explode anyway, which is weird as I thought they had to be infused with something, but it doesn't really matter. Although I guess being a Quincy, it's possible that Bambietta can just infuse her reishi bombs with the very air itself if she wants to. As Komamura scolds Hinamori for being reckless, Bambietta appears behind him and he swings at her, the Quincy swooping away and tossing another bomb towards him. One small note again. There is a severe Shikai shortage in the 1000-Year Blood War arc. It would have been awesome to see Komamura bring Tenken down upon Bambietta, and also give us a great clue as to his new power. Tenken in general is a very underutilized Shikai, but alas, maybe in the anime. Komamura theorizes that thanks to his immense heft and the delay between a bomb's impact and detonation, he might be able to veer the blast off course if he strikes fast enough. However, just as the bomb reaches him, he suddenly senses something is wrong and pulls his head out of the way, deflecting it entirely with his arm instead. And as the blast rips through his gauntlet, something strange is hinted at. Komamura's arm looks a little different to how we remember it, but it could just be a result of the blast, so nothing to look too deep into right now. Bambietta reveals the truth of her shrift. Her power can't be blocked. She isn't firing bombs at all, but reishi, and anything she fires her reishi into becomes a bomb. It's a neat twist on the power. It makes it a little more interesting, but crucially it makes it incredibly dangerous, as Bambietta has essentially an unlimited arsenal of explosives freely at her disposal. It also makes it impossible for her enemies to hide or defend against her, and means her shrift is far more deadly than first thought. Regardless, Bambietta flies up into the sky and unleashes a massive barrage of reishi towards Komamura, who orders Hinamori to get behind him. Komamura places his hand on the ground beside Shinji, and in a close-up shot we get another glimpse. Something weird is definitely going on with his appearance under the armor. But there's no time to think about it, as Komamura is slammed with colossal explosions, an enormous fireball devastating and engulfing the rooftop. However, when the dust clears, Bambietta is shocked to see what lies beneath Komamura's armor after all. Komamura is no longer a wolfman. In his place stands a human. While some elements of his beastly self are still present, he is, for all intents and purposes, now human, and we're whisked back to the events of the mysterious Elder's Cave. This is an amazing twist, one that I audibly gasped at when I first read the chapter. I genuinely couldn't believe what I was seeing, and I actually ranked this as one of the top 10 best twists in all of Bleach in a separate video. While we unfortunately don't get to see the fight between Komamura and his grandfather, it looks like it was fairly brutal, as most of Komamura's uniform has been destroyed, but regardless, he was victorious. Komamura's grandfather reveals to him the secret of their beast clan. They were once humans who received something called the punishment of the beasts, seemingly a curse that turned them into werewolves. Upon their deaths, the werewolf clan were sent to the Beast Realm, or the Hell of Beasts, for the sins they committed in their lifetime, the same sins which presumably saw them bestowed with that terrible punishment. However, even the Beast Realm wasn't enough to hold them, so they returned to the Soul Society and began to live in hiding forevermore. Komamura's grandfather reveals that by temporarily severing the chain of sin that binds them all, they can return to the forms they had long before they were afflicted with that curse, their original human selves. As Komamura wonders how he can achieve this form, his grandfather demands payment. If Komamura is willing to tear out his heart and present it to the Elder, he will teach him the transformation. It's awesome, it's surprisingly metal, but it's definitely a big ask. And I always liked the way Komamura glances down at his own hand in doubt. When his grandfather senses his hesitation, he tells him he doesn't need to worry, as he should feel no obligation to throw his life away for the Shinigami, and if he doesn't want to do it, he doesn't have to. But it's at this that Komamura has his realization. Komamura was unable to bear a life of hiding in the shadows, so he abandoned his clan, donning a helmet that insulted who he was. He was an outcast, a pariah with nobody or nothing to call his own, but Yamamoto of all people took him in. This is something we already knew. Komamura had stated in the past that he owes his life to the head captain, but I really wish we'd seen that interaction. I wonder how much, if any, knowledge Yamamoto has of the Beast Clan of Sinners and what his reaction was to finding one of them alone and out in the open. It also seems uncharacteristically charitable of a younger, more hardened Yamamoto. Perhaps he simply thought he could use Komamura's power at the time. Regardless, Komamura goes on to state that he owes Yamamoto an enormous debt, and as Yamamoto's life was taken from him by the Quincy's, he too must now stake his own life on avenging Yamamoto's. It's a great moment for a fantastic character. Although Komamura's intentions seem noble, and personally I think they are, he is at the same time unknowingly following that same path of vengeance that he once spoke out against to Tosen. That same path that consumed Tosen and left a hole in Komamura's heart, in his own words from way back in the Rancor arc. That's really just great stuff from Kubo. And so Komamura tears out his heart in a splatter of blood, becoming a human once more. It looks to me like we might actually see this moment in the anime based on the trailer, which is really cool. But then we return to the battlefield, where Komamura activates his Bankai, revealing its new, monstrous, corpse-like form. As Kokujo Tengen Myo Dangai Joy rises, enormous chunks of its armour fall away, piece by piece. I do wonder how this might have played out if Komamura hadn't got his Bankai back yet. Would he have just fought Bambietta himself? That could have been awesome to see, to be fair. But Dangai Joy brings its blade down, decimating an entire building as Bambietta escapes the dust and rubble. Bambietta soars into the air. And by the way, I do like how some Quincy's really utilise the power of flight when they gain their wings, and launches another bomb, this time directly at Dangai Joy. The creature raises its hand and the Reishi blast detonates, shattering its hand to pieces, only for it to slowly reforge, pulling itself back together again. Considering this power, I'm not sure why Komamura felt it necessary to protect Dangai Joy's face, but still, it's a cool visual. Komamura explains that Dangai Jaw is his Bankai with its armour removed, as Dangai Jaw brings its massive hand down upon Bambietta, seemingly flattening her beneath it atop a building. However, the sternritter destroys the hand again with an explosion and escapes upwards, now charred and bruised. Bambietta is confused. She simply believes that by removing his Bankai's armour and exposing his own power, Komamura is exposing his own weakness to her. However, as Komamura blocks another blast, he reveals the truth of the situation. As we've known for a while, Kokujo Tengen Myo is a reflection of Komamura himself, in the fact it shares the same movements and even injuries between the two of them, but it goes deeper than that. The Bankai's suit of armour is a reflection of Komamura's very own life, his own existence. The fact the armour stands tall and lives at all is due to it having life breathed into it for as long as Komamura lives. So imagine the armour of Kokujo Tengen Myo like being the external part of Komamura. It's like an empty shell surrounding the essence of life, which is essentially how you have to imagine Komamura at this moment as well. But since Komamura reached into his own chest and tore out the source of his life, his heart, he's now become a dead man walking. And the same is true for Kokujo Tengen Myo. Having shed its armour, its life, it's now just an empty corpse. Again, go back to that idea of imagining both Komamura and Kokujo Tengen Myo as these fragile, vase-like things that house the essence of life inside them. By smashing into their fragile exterior and pulling out the essence of life, there's nothing inside, which means they're now empty, walking shells, but they also can't die. But Bambietta doesn't know this yet, and she counters by claiming that it doesn't matter that the Bankai itself is lifeless, Komamura can still be killed, and she launches 2 massive blasts directly at Dangai Joy, and they slam into its chest. As the same injury is then reflected on Komamura, Bambietta gloats, only to realise that yes, he's still standing. As the smoke clears, we get another very cool shot of Komamura, a gaping hole in his chest where his heart once was. He reveals that his family's secret power is to gain a temporarily immortal body by offering up their hearts. As long as he's a human, he cannot die. Unsurprisingly, now getting a little concerned, Bambietta tries to flee, and I like the little detail of her energy trails taking the shape of a heart as she flies away, but Komamura gives chase, leaping behind her in an amazing display of tenacity and terror. Bambietta, now genuinely horrified, questions what the point in this is. Why give up his life? A fight to the death is a fight to survive. If you throw away your life, then what are you even fighting for anymore? I think this gives us a nice and intriguing little insight into who Bambietta is as a character, especially since we won't be getting much more of that in the rest of the story, but it kind of implies that she is fighting, I guess, just for the right to survive, the right to be the last one standing. But as she says all of this, Bambietta bombards Dangai Joe with more and more firepower in a desperate but futile attempt to destroy him. And as the dust swirls, Komamura claims that he hasn't thrown his life away at all. He's merely staked it on this battle, just as Yamamoto once did. There's a great panel of Komamura's human mouth surrounded by the essence of his previous self, showing that no matter what appearance he might have, what form of Komamura he might be taking, the original Komamura's values continue to ebb and flow through him. And then, as Dangai Joy re-emerges from the smoke, Komamura, in one of my favourite lines of the entire arc, leaps forward and roars that as soon as he stepped foot on this battlefield, he left his life behind. And as he says this, Dangai Joy also leaps into the air to catch up to Bambietta, swings his sword on an amazing double-page spread, and connects with the sternritter in a violent explosion, and seemingly ending the fight. It's a powerful and dramatic way to end things off, and I love it. I definitely harbour some apprehension about how this fight might look in the anime. Bambietta's glittering red holy form looks amazing, but I'm still wary of Dangai Joy being CGI. I don't know if it's really going to be able to capture the true gargantuan majesty of this thing, but I guess we'll have to see. As we enter the final chapter of the fight, we get a small glimpse of a young child Komamura, proving Komamura has most likely had the appearance of a wolfman his entire life, as his grandfather warmly muses that Komamura is finally one of them, and he's proud of him. Back on the battlefield, Bambietta watches in horror as her own reishi blasts are deflected back at her by Dangai Joy's mammoth blade, causing her own body to be turned into a bomb. As she explodes in midair, her tattered and smoking body falls from the sky, crashing into the cityscape below. Meanwhile, Dangai Joy lands on the ground as well in a slightly more dignified way, Yhwach's castle of Silburn in its sights. Unfortunately, the moment it takes a step, the giant buckles. Komamura collapses to his knees as Dangai Joy fractures, disappearing into dust on the wind. Komamura staggers along the ground, desperate to reach the Quincy headquarters. Blood seems to be trailing behind him now. I wonder if his injuries are catching up to him now that his power is fading away. What follows is a very bleak and a very sad ending for Komamura, as he's consumed by the cost of his power, his sacrifice becoming evident. Komamura stumbles, watching as he begins to transform into a beast completely. He's no longer a human, and he's no longer even a wolfman, a go-between of the two realms. Instead, he's fully descending into beasthood as a result of his chasing revenge. That is their sin, their true form, and by devolving into an animal, Komamura has finally returned to the heart of the clan he once abandoned. I'll be honest, as poetic as this moment is, I always find it peculiar and hard to discern. I've never been certain what Kubo's intentions were here. In my opinion, despite portraying the quest for revenge as a net negative, he is portraying Komamura in a tragic light, and I've also always felt that conversely, on the flip side of that, he seems to be portraying Komamura's elder as something of a villain. The elder is grateful that Komamura has given up his life as a human, and that Komamura should be furious with himself, that he should curse his desire for vengeance. The elder claims he will live longer and sustain himself by drinking Komamura's own sinister resentment, and that he thanks him for becoming a dumb animal for his sake. But this doesn't quite line up for me, because in a way it feels like the elder used Komamura, used his beastly instincts against him, as Komamura seemed unaware that this was the price he was going to have to pay after transforming. Now, admittedly, yes, it was Komamura's own choice to seek out his grandfather, and it was Komamura's own choice to rip out his heart, but it definitely seems like he's been slightly strung along here. Who or what the Elder is a truly fascinating point of discussion, and maybe a video itself one day. But considering he is totally animalistic in appearance, we can assume he has been through this process himself once before. Is Komamura's fall from grace actually going to serve as a way to extend the Elder's life? Was that a literal thing he was talking about? Considering he then quite literally devours Komamura's heart, I think it might be. Or it's just a twisted way of showing that the Elder cares for Komamura in his own sense, and is welcoming him back into the fold where he's always belonged. But as a wolf now, Komamura crumples to the ground next to his Zanpakuto, unable to even hold it. He lies there, pondering the price he's having to pay, realizing that he once preached the same words to Tozen without heeding them himself. It's here, though, in the very last moments of the fight, that Kubo tries to portray Komamura as being in the right all along, to some degree anyway. Iba arrives and picks up his fallen captain, who is crestfallen that he has given in to revenge and is now paying the price for it, but Iba reassures him that no matter what's happened here, he's done nothing wrong. Wanting to avenge Yamamoto, who took Komamura in so long ago, is a noble intention, as I mentioned earlier, and all the Gotei 13 feel exactly the same way, reflected in Iba's words. As Iba says to Komamura that they will defeat Yhwach for Yamamoto's sake, Komamura's eyes widen. He has paid a hefty price for his revenge, but he is not alone in wanting it. Honestly, it's a brutal ending for Komamura, even if I do enjoy this subplot. It's the very definition of a Pyrrhic victory, and I do feel sorry for the captain. He gets robbed of absolutely everything for trying to do right by the man who rescued him, only to be dragged back into the pitch-black darkness of his clan, the very clan he once tried to escape. So, what is the lesson here? What's the moral of this story? Because Kubo doesn't seem to be saying that revenge is purely bad. Iba reaffirms that. So is the issue here that Komamura sought out his clan, who are a family of fiendish sinners, supposedly? Like I said, the Elder definitely strikes me as somewhat suspicious, or at least of dubious honour, but it's hard to say. I really wish that Kubo would revisit Komamura. If he appears in the Hell arc, I would be all for a small subplot of him trying to restore his Wolfman form. I think he deserves it. he certainly doesn't deserve such a harsh ending here, an ending that completely writes him out of the arc, and perhaps even the story in the future to come. Plus, there's just the brutal fact that it probably wasn't worth it. Komamura has to give up literally everything to defeat one sternritter, and what's even worse is that Bambietta actually returns later on. Admittedly, she's a shell of her former self, but still. All of that said, this is a very enjoyable fight, I think. I don't think it's Komamura's best fight in the series, at least not in my opinion. That honour still goes to his battle with Tozen and Hisagi. But this is a good fight nonetheless, and I think it does a really good job of acting as a sequel to that fight. An unexpected sequel. I don't think anyone really thought we would get this, but I do love that story of revenge and being driven by a desire for vengeance, allowing it to consume you, to swallow up your heart. The fact that it follows on from all of that and brings it full circle in a really nice, if admittedly tragic way, is great. I certainly didn't expect it, and I'm really glad that Komamura got this kind of spotlight, again, even if it does end in a bad way for him, because I do think this fight is very memorable, and goes down certainly as probably one of the most intriguing battles of the Thousand Year Blood War arc as a whole, and I'm certainly really looking forward to seeing it in the anime. But how would I change things? Well, Kubo, if you take a step back and have a look at the Thousand Year Blood War arc from above, Kubo seemed to really enjoy compartmentalizing in this arc, and I get it. There's absolutely loads going on and a ton of characters to control, so it makes sense to me that he would write things in 3 or 4 chapter chunks, which is essentially how the arc plays out, and then after that chunk is ended, basically cut it off and have it have no real influence on what's going on around it, especially when it comes to these smaller supporting characters. But I don't think Komamura needed to completely vanish after this fight. Imagine if he remained in his human form, but perhaps he was slightly weaker or he was tiring or something like that. In his rage, in his revenge-addled mind, he wants to attack Yhwach's palace immediately, but Iba steps in and as his vice-captain talks him down, saying there's more good he can do here on the battlefield. Later we see some of that as Komamura assists Shinji and Momo in rescuing Omaida, and then later arrives at the stronghold with everyone else. We could have some great interactions here, with people either not recognising Komamura or just being amazed by his appearance. And personally, I just love to get a bit more time with human Komamura. Again, going back to that idea of Kubo doing some severe compartmentalising in this arc means that we spend very small pockets of time with some of the coolest changes this arc actually introduces. But then upon heading up to the royal palace, Komamura either engages with Gerard in a battle of the Titans, or perhaps more fittingly, I think, Yhwach himself. Maybe this is where Komamura's drive for revenge gets the better of him and he goes ahead of everyone else. And it would be here that he falls. I really like the idea of him challenging Yhwach, so much so that I made an entire what-if video about it. But even with his immortal human body, Komamura is no match for the Quincy king, and eventually falls at his feet, transforming into a wolf as his power wears off at the worst possible time. A much more fitting punishment for his revenge, since he's actually facing down the person he wants to get revenge on. It also works, I think, as it reinforces this idea that it's not so much Komamura's quest for vengeance that's what's wholly wrong here, it would be the fact that this quest for revenge fuels a hubris in Komamura that eventually leads to him losing sight of himself eventually, which is what gets him into such big trouble against Yhwach. I really think this would have been much more fitting for the character and given us a lot more time with him as well, that his revenge drives him to reach all the way to Yhwach's throne room only to fall there. Whether he dies or not, I don't know. I don't think it really matters, to be honest, but I'd have loved to have seen him utilised like that. It also just doesn't really make sense that his power vanishes as soon as Bambietta is beaten. Like, did it know somehow? Was he only guaranteed one fight as part of a package deal with this human transformation? Either way, Komamura isn't dead in the canon story, but he has been changed, seemingly forever. Meanwhile, across the city, Bambietta lies immobile on the ground, a smoking husk. She's exasperated at the fact that she was the first of the Bambis to lose, but is suddenly surrounded by the rest of them. In a very creepy and sinister scene, Giselle decides that they will help her out because it'd be lonely without Bambietta around. As Bambietta pleads with Giselle not to do whatever it is she's about to do, the fight officially comes to an end here, with the sun beginning to set on the first day of battle. But that's it for the video, guys. I really hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments below what you think of Komamura versus Bambietta. How excited are you to finally get to see this fight in the anime? What do you think of this fight in general? What do you think of Komamura's human transformation and, of course, the new version of his Bankai? How do you feel about the way I would change things here at the end of the video? I'd love to get your thoughts on that as well, and maybe even your own versions of how you would continue to write Komamura into the story way past his disappearance in the canon version. Make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done already, give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and until next time I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.